All right, so today I am talking with Mike Schley, a great cartographer and a great illustrator in my view. I'm looking very much forward to speaking to him. But I just want to drop something you might find interesting. I have made a Facebook page, which you can find below this podcast as you're listening to it right now. And I have also made a Patreon where you can support the podcast. So the Patreon is called at patreon.com/thestorypodcast without any underscores and slashes and dots. Just straight out the story podcast. Make sure to go and visit this Patreon I made. So I hope you'll enjoy this podcast as much as I will, because Mike Schley is one of my favorite cartographers right now, and he have been that for a long time. On to the podcast. So today on the podcast, I'm very fortunate to have Mike Schley with me. He's one of two people that I admire when it comes to map making. The other one I am talking to tomorrow and is called Jerry Gritzinger. Stay tuned for that. But today I have Mike with me. Hello, Mike. How are you?
Hi. Doing great. How are you?
I'm fine. I'm very excited to have you on.
Oh, thank you.
So, if you could give us, me and the listeners, a little introduction to who you are and why you decided to make maps.
Okay, so my name's Mike Schley. I have been working in the game development industry since about 2000. I started making maps well before I started even making art, really. As a kid, I used to wander through, as a little kid, I used to wander through my neighborhood and go back home and try and map out, and this is well before, digital mapping like Google Maps or anything like that. But I used to try and map out my neighborhood with the intention of running role-playing games or like Twilight 2000 scenarios. This was back in the 80s. But essentially trying to understand what my neighborhood was and how I could use that as a element in the very simple games that my buddies and I used to play. Sort of started me out in thinking about cartography or thinking about map making in general. And growing up with National Geographic coming out and big poster maps all over my walls, it was just something that kind of really defined a part of my childhood that I always held on to. Later on, I went to art school in high school and college, studied fine arts, and kind of veered away from gaming or map making just due to a lack of time, and found myself, looking for work as a designer or a graphic designer after college. And luckily, I got a job in 2000 as a designer for a company called The Cipher. We were making collectible card games and role-playing games based on film properties. So we made collectible card games for Star Wars, Star Trek, Lord of the Rings, and particularly when Lord of the Rings came out, we were making a role-playing game based on that as well. And we would get in these maps from a cartographer whose name's escaping me at the time, but I just used to love poring over the artwork that we would get in and thinking, man, I'd love to be able to do this. Didn't really have the opportunity at the time, and so it was just kind of a passing thought. And then in 2004, I went to work for Paizo Publishing. They publish games, and particularly Pathfinder right now. But at the time, they were publishing the print versions of Dungeon Magazine and Dragon Magazine, and I came on as a designer for both and wound up being the associate art director for Dungeon Magazine. when the way the Dungeon Magazine was built was that essentially Dragon Magazine was sort of a resource for players of D&D and role-playing games in general, but mainly D&D. And Dungeon Magazine was more of a resource for DMs in that it included story arcs, suggestions for, how to run a game effectively, and nuances of rules, things like that. Well, in the process, one of the big responsibilities for me as the art director was to send out art orders for illustrations and specifically for cartography for these little mini scenarios that we would publish in the magazine. And I only had a few cartographers that I could rely on at the time, just because there were only a few that were, particularly good that I was aware of, or that I had the opportunity to work with. And I was constantly kind of under the gun to find decent maps. And because of my previous experience with design and illustration and fine art, I knew I could, just take care of a series of maps if I needed to. And I ended up doing a couple of adventures just out of necessity, or mapping a couple of adventures out of necessity, and realized just how much I loved it. And kind of got back to my roots. So at that point, I started picking up projects from Wizards of the Coast. I think that was in 2005. And I have been working with them on a regular basis since about 2005. I was busy enough that I went ahead and put in my notice at Paizo in order to work as an illustrator and cartographer, and I was doing half and half, sort of half illustration, half cartography, professional time. And since then, it's just been a continual increase in activity, and I kind of had to focus on cartography, and it kind of forced me to really think about what my style was and how I was going to kind of push that and try and develop not only my style, but hopefully a new, like, how could I raise the bar each time I worked on a new project, and really sort of push the industry or the aesthetic with each new step.
You really made a style that, to me, is very coherent with Dungeons and Dragons. It's when I think of D&D and I think maps, I think of your style.
Aw.
So it's
that's a wonderful compliment. Thank you.
So, what happened after you started working with Wizards of the Coast?
Okay, so I guess that was back in 2000. I worked on a few projects that they were my first ventures into map making for RPGs, and I think the first thing that I ever worked on was Weapons of Legacy, and they were pretty crude, but I stuck with it, and as things went on, the next large project. I mean, I had a lot of smaller adventures and smaller projects, but I think Red Hand of Doom came out, and that kind of really pushed me to think about the overall feel of the projects that I worked on as a whole, as opposed to simply just banging out a map. I spent a lot of time thinking about how those maps interrelated with one another and with the story specifically, and then further and more importantly, what made Dungeons and Dragons maps D&D maps as opposed to any other property or any other type of map. So as time progressed, and as 4th edition came along, which I won't discuss, I still continued to try and identify what it was about the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and specifically the Forgotten Realms, that made it unique, and that included a variety of factors, from everything from border design treatment to texture of surface to the feel that the maps could be set in this world, but they were contemporary in the sense that they were functional and not so anachronistic that they were simply, objects or simply parts of that. They were. I wanted them to feel as if they were part of the world, but you were also part of the world at the same time. And so the way that you interface with the maps or the way that you could read the maps were useful and contemporary. So even though they feel as though they could be part of that ancient history or part of that other world, they weren't so separate from what you need as a DM or as a player to appreciate them or use them. Like, I didn't want them to feel unuseful because of an overabundance of, torn edges and, water stains and things like that. So even though those things exist in a subtle way, the most important thing to me is the evocative nature of the map and the usefulness of the map and the design of the map to be read easily and understood at a glance.
So let's try to take the map Fandalen into account, because when you're looking at that map, it kind of looks kind of similar to a small town in real life, and that's the one thing that I find really hard to do myself when I draw maps, is how to get that town feeling that someone lives here, and how to structure the buildings. So what's your approach to doing that?
So with Phandalin and with other town, specifically with small town maps, and it's a little easier to do this with simpler maps like Phandalin or like Red Larch from Princes of the Apocalypse, where you can easily identify kind of what you can identify the history of a town by the way that it's built around its geographical space. So the first thing I honestly start off with is thinking about the geography of the place, so that I can understand why a town would exist there as opposed to anywhere else. So when I'm looking at Phandalin, which I've got up on screen in front of me right now, there's a central meeting area, or a opening in the road where multiple roads converge, and obviously towards the center of a town, you're going to have the larger buildings. You're going to have the older, more established area of a neighborhood where those roads converge, because it's essentially a crossing point, or a point in a trade route that serves as either an overnight, if an inn's there, it's there because people need a place to stay at a certain point between locations, or if it's a area that's designed around mining, there's going to be mines on the outskirts. Phandalin in particular, you can see that the history of that location by one of the factors is this ruined defensive wall around the periphery. Now, it's obviously not a major wall, so it's not a military hub, but the fact that there is a small ruined wall around the edge gives a sense of how old that town is. It gives it a sense of being lived in. So some of the buildings are a little rotten and decrepit. They're typically older. The larger buildings are towards the center. There's forests along the edge or outside of that defensive wall. There's a ruined manor up on the hill. Typically, if it's, if there's a higher location or a higher point in elevation, that's where the either a defensive fort or a rich home. In a small town, typically the nicer homes are higher in elevation, so that when there's flooding, they don't have to worry about pumping out the basements. But in this case, there's a ruined manor that the Trissander Manor is up on the hill because it was at some point the nicest building in town, probably when this when the wall was first erected, because it's easily defensible. It lends itself to that structure. So what you're looking at in Phandalin is essentially an older town that's had a heyday that's come and gone, but it's still an active town. And the formation of the geography affects where those small farming areas are going to be, how the form of the wall and the buildings and the intersecting crossroads are going to sort of weave through that environment. So it's sort of a holistic approach to understanding why this location is specific to the people that live there. Like why, there's a lot of thought that goes into how the people that live there and the site is directly related to its geography, if that makes sense. I know I'm rambling on, but
it's also a very, very good starting city for a starting set,
Yes.
So it's very, there's not a lot of information to take in on this map.
I try and keep it fairly simple in the sense that it's not like looking at a map of Waterdeep where you're not quite sure where to start. It's a smaller sort of bite-sized introduction.
You mentioned that the wall was broken down. I feel like that also tells something about the area around the city, because they don't have to build defense to keep something horrific out.
So
it tells much more than just the city.
It does. If there were constant invasions of orcs, then you would have to have a defensive wall that was maintained, on the regular. So there's not only is there a reference to the town's history, but there's definitely a connection between the contemporary existence of the town and what's beyond its borders. And I think that's actually a wonderful point, and that the way that you build an image can speak not only to the image, but what's outside of the image, and how the image or how the location sits in context with the world around it. And there's little factors just like that, just like what you pointed out, allow for or give direction to storytelling outside of the map.
You also mentioned that manor on top of the hill. If the land was in prosperity, that manor would probably have been rebuilt or something. So a map tells a lot of things.
Yep.
So that was Phandalin. So if we go a little, I don't know if we go back or forward in time now, but you have done some work with the campaign cartographer 3+. A simple set called Dungeons of Schley. How did that came to be?
So I think that was Dungeons of Schley started right around the same time that that I was working on Phandalin, I'd be hard pressed to give you an exact linear or exact linear timeline. I'd have to go back to my business lives to figure it all out. But I think it was around the same time. I'd been discussing working on updating Campaign Cartographer with Pro Fantasy just about the time. I think that was about five and a half years ago. And I'd been approached to do it just through casual contact with the folks over at Pro Fantasy, and they were really interested, and I was really interested. And I mentioned that I would love to produce a project. We hadn't settled on the name Dungeons of Schley yet, but there was an assumption that I would work on Campaign Cartographer 3+, and I would also have the opportunity to work on my own project as well under the Pro Fantasy umbrella. And I wanted to create a way for folks to utilize my artwork in a program like CC3+, but not. I didn't want to exactly replicate my. I didn't want to replicate my D&D work, but I wanted it to still feel like my hand. So it's simplified, and it's still got my flavor, but it's a little different than what I do for D&D. But because I feel like that sort of naturalistic approach is so iconic to what fantasy can be, or so important to what fantasy can be, that it definitely looks like my hand. And because I was developing it around the same time that I was developing the maps for the initial outlay for 5th edition, they do have a stylistic similarity. Right now, actually, I'm working on an addition to the Dungeons of Schley. Well, not an addition to Dungeons of Schley, rather a new set called Cities of Schley, where producing a huge suite that's primarily geared towards letting DMs or cartographers in general build their own cityscapes and town designs, similar to Dungeons of Schley. So it's all icons and textures, and the technical interface is done by Pro Fantasy. I do all the artwork and all the texture mapping and things like that.
So it's quite modular. You can move things around.
Absolutely. That's its main draw. It's part of a software package that Pro Fantasy puts out, so you can use it within Campaign Cartographer as an addition to their tool set, or you can use it separately in that each object or texture is a PNG file. So if you work in Photoshop or you work in some other application, you can still utilize those resources in whatever application you're comfortable with. I also, last summer, I published the first in hopefully a long series of adventures called Schleyscapes, which...
That was in Kickstarter, right?
Yeah, that was through Kickstarter, and it went really well, and I had a ton of fun working on that. I've got to find the time to make... I've got a huge story arc that's written and planned out. It just takes a lot of time to work on them. So hopefully the next episode will be out, shortly. I got to finish Cities of Schley and a new project for Wizards of the Coast, which I can't talk about.
I won't ask.
Suffice it to say that I'm lucky enough to maintain really good relationships with the folks at Pro Fantasy and at Wizards of the Coast over the long term. So I keep working on new projects for them. I also do stuff for publishers like HarperCollins, Scholastic Books, Little Brown and Company, Hatchet Book Group. They're all good folks to work with.
Mm. So it's not only maps you do.
Yeah, yeah.
It's only maps. Or
well, no, it's not. As far as my professional capacity goes, I've done a lot of illustration in the past. Currently, as far as work goes, as far as what pays the bills, I mainly focus on maps. I would say 95 to 99% of my paid gigs right now are somehow related to cartography or world building in general. That being said, Schlyscapes gives me the opportunity to not only build, maps of locations that, folks can import into their own games, but also create creature illustrations or landscape scenes or character illustrations. So and as well as creating story seeds and narrative arcs and the bones of storytelling. So the thing that really gets me excited about Schlyscapes in particular is that it allows me to flex numerous muscles and really kind of dive into a project in a way that I don't really have the opportunity to when I'm working for a client. And it
yeah,
go ahead.
I only thought that Schlyscapes were like this. Was the video was a building, right, where the roofs come off and you can go down to the cellar?
Yeah. So what I'm doing with Schlyscapes is creating what you could think of as a master map of a site or a location. Each episode would include a location that you can port into your own homebrew game. And in that location, you have a main sort of master map that is also broken down into submaps. So if you've got the ground floor of a cabin, there are additional maps that are attached to that are the upstairs, downstairs, basement, various areas like outbuildings and things like that. But it's built in such a way that you can easily print it to your home printer and overlay those areas onto the tabletop as needed. So if your characters are exploring the ground floor and they haven't gone upstairs yet, they're not going to see the upstairs portion of the map until you place that tile down. Like, if they go up the stairs, then you place the printed tile of the upstairs portion of the map down over top of what you've already got set out. And so starting from that basis, I wanted to be able to create miniature scenarios that have story seeds, have incredibly useful maps that are as useful in a multiplicity of ways as possible. So, on the one hand, I have it printed, I have it ready to go so that you can print it at home. I've got a version that you could send directly to a large format printer if you wanted to print a massive tabletop map. I've got black and white versions, like low ink versions. I've got digital versions that are specifically designed to be used in a digital tabletop program or a virtual tabletop program. I've got illustrations of characters or objects that might be found in the site so that the DM can quickly if they want to use. I built up a novel or a new creature called the Spider Bear that shows up in episode 1. So I wanted to create an illustration of what that looked like and mock up a stat block for it and give you a sense of what that creature might do in this situation. And then let's see what else. yeah, there, and with all of these little elements or details in mind, it's also connected to a much larger storyline that deals with the characters in a world called Fernway. That's a world of my own creation, and is sort of a fantasy cartographer's playground.
Yeah, so I need to get that.
Yeah. Yep. Everybody else needs to get it too.
Yeah.
So that's a really fun project that I can't wait to really produce more and delve more thoroughly into. One of the interesting things that I found in building that as well was I created almost sort of like a Instagram teaser or Instagram trailer for the game. Mm-hmm. And if you go to, if you search for Schleyscapes, SCHLEYSCAPES _ I think it's EP1, or just search for Schleyscapes episode 1. I used the Instagram interface because of its grid format as a way to be able to explore the map in that user interface, so that each 5-foot square of the map, at least I took a small portion of the map and broke those 5-foot squares down into tiles for the Instagram interface, so that when you click through those tiles, or when you click on the tile, it zooms you into that tile, but you can also see ways to navigate through the world, so you can move outside of the tiles into new areas, or you can follow little arrows, so that, like, if you see a basement entrance and you click on that basement entrance through the Instagram interface, it takes you into the basement, and essentially it takes you to a new profile that was created around that section of the map. So you're upstairs, you click on a little red arrow, it takes you downstairs, or it can take you into the basement, or into the carriage house, or the barn, or different areas. So it allows, through the interface, it allows you to explore the world and discover little bits of the world as a teaser to the actual game, or to the actual supplement.
Have you tried playing it yourself, like your own setting?
Yeah. I mean, I've played through the setting a number of times. Luckily, go figure, I have friends that are DMs and Dungeons and Dragons players. So it was a whole lot of fun, and I wanted it to be generic enough so that you could port it into a variety of different systems, so that it works in Pathfinder, it works in D&D. As long as you're in a fantasy role-playing setting, I wanted it to be useful, but I wanted it to feel specific to a location. So, and I think a lot of the cartography and a lot of the map making that I do kind of has that in mind, and that I want the map that you're looking at, if it's of a location in the Forgotten Realms, I want you to be able to tell that it's in the Forgotten Realms, but you could also use it as a map of a location in your own homebrew, or in some other world, because if a DM can get as much use out of the maps as a resource, then all the better.
I've done that multiple times with your maps. I have only played, the starter set, and I only have gotten as far as I have only gotten to the Goblin Cave and playing through the Tristan Manor. I haven't. That's the only place I have tried to play in the Sword Coast setting ish. Yeah. So then I tried to go to search on your website, and you have all these maps in Yeah.
Yeah, one of
It's
the
such a huge world.
thanks. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the reasons why I make sure to include players' versions, like unmarked players' versions of the maps, with my downloads. I mean, on the one hand, yes, they're useful in a gameplay situation, but on the other hand, if I can provide the basic geography or the look of the area without the tags, that allows the DM to kind of repurpose those maps for their own homebrew or for their own stories. And yeah, I've got a lot of work on the website, but you should see how much work I have that I have not put on my website.
I would love to see that.
Oh, God, do you have a few days? I've probably worked on over 3,000 or so maps, published maps for D&D, Pathfinder.
How do you keep them like stand out from each other? Do let's say the Wizard of the Coast have like a pitch for location?
So when Wizards of the Coast or any other art director really sends me an art order, if I'm not already familiar with the storyline or with the world, I usually try and get in contact with the authors or the editors to get a sense of, like, I might get a few introductory paragraphs, or just try and research as much as I can about the general flavor of the world. And oftentimes I might get rough pencil schematics of the area before I actually start mapping it. And sometimes it honestly depends on who I'm working with. Sometimes I have a lot of free reign in developing the look and feel of the world and of the map specifically. Sometimes it's much more programmatic. I try and steer myself towards the projects that have more say over, just because I feel like it keeps me more motivated to really do work that's to the best of my ability.
But don't you feel like, as a creative person, you need some constraints in a way?
Oh, you do. You definitely do. But I don't look at them so much as constraints, or I don't look at them as constraints so much as I look at them as collaborative relationships. So a number of times I've spoken with editors or with authors specifically about geographic details that they might mention that just don't work logically, and that I've had to overrule. But a lot of times, when it comes down to it, if I'm illustrating a map that works with the story, I've got to keep that story in mind, because it doesn't matter, if especially if it's a novel, or an in-sheet map for a novel. It doesn't matter what I think about how the map should look if the map doesn't work with the story. It's got to, you've got to be able to look at the map and place yourself in that world in direct relationship to the text. So if I were to go into heavy detail in an area that has absolutely nothing to do with the storyline, that can act as a distraction or a bump in the road or a hiccup when the reader's just trying to figure out where they are in the world, or where they are in the story. If that makes sense.
It does. So I might take kind of a leap here, but I want to talk to you about the image you made with the Dwarven Stronghold.
Oh yeah.
It's an isometric map, and there's like a huge stronghold placed on the top of. Is it a rock or is it a mountainside?
It's sort of it's an escarpment or kind of a geological formation within kind of a canyon area. So that actually was that was originally for the Dungeon Master's Guide, the 5th edition DMG. And if you don't mind, I can go into kind of how how this image and other images from the set kind of came to be.
Yeah, sure.
As the 5th edition rule books were coming out, I knew that they wanted me to develop, a series of images that were kind of iconic images, not specifically related to any story text, but to kind of establish the overall feel of the world of D&D. Not specifically Forgotten Realms, but generally kind of with that in mind. And so they gave me, I think I had a month to complete, I want to say about 24 finished images.
A month?
They were, yeah, about a month. I had a month.
All right.
Yeah. Yeah, it was
gotta get to work.
Yeah, I was pulling my hair out real late. And this is one of the images that came out of that. But the thing was that in the art order, they didn't give me hardly any guidelines other than, I think specifically the extent of the text that they sent me related to this image was, please provide an image of a dwarven stronghold. And that was it. So,
okay.
I'm thinking about, how could I build something that felt like dwarves made it, but you could still see it above ground? Because so much of dwarven construction, you would assume, would be underground mines and tunnel systems and things that you can't really visualize unless you create in really complex cutaway views. So I wanted to think about, what kind of construction in the real world could sort of speak to that kind of mountain strongholds system without being underground. So I was looking at medieval monasteries, specifically from the coasts of, along the coasts of Greece. So it's still Western in its general aesthetic, but it's still fantastic enough that it doesn't feel like something you would see every day. So I wanted a defensive location that was easily defensible and very difficult to get to, but was still unique and evocative and looked like it was being used contemporarily and not like a ruin. And then I just stopped thinking and started drawing.
And that's one of the best approach you can do.
Yeah. Yep.
So this image is like it's isometric, and I see this more and more pop up into my Twitter feed that people do isometric maps. It's something that happens more and more. Why do you think that is?
Because I think it serves as a map on the one hand, but it's almost a merging between cartography and landscape painting, in that essentially a map is a landscape, but it's a utilitarian landscape primarily. So you're looking at the landscape from the top down, and it's a way to organize space. Well, a isometric view has that utility in that it gives you a sense of how the location is set in space, but it also allows you the artistic leeway to create essentially what is a landscape, but without a horizon line. And there's a variety of ways, or there are a variety of approaches to isometric mapping or to perspective mapping that are, there's a different way to approach isometric maps between whether you're just trying to show a perspective view of a portion of the world, or whether that map needs to be utilizable in like a software package or a online game. For instance, I did a lot of isometric maps for a series called Sorcery, produced by Inkle Games. It came out for iPhones and Androids over about a 5-year period. I think it was 4 games over a 5-year period. And it was essentially based on an old Choose Your Own Adventure series. But anyways, the maps in that had to, like, the buildings at the far end of the map had to be the same size as the buildings in the closer edge of the map, so that it wasn't in perspective, but it was still as if seen in perspective. So you could have the same size, character moving from this is kind of aesthetic theory or theory of visualization, but if you look at something in perspective, obviously the objects that are further away from you are going to get smaller. So an isometric map that functions as a map has to sort of fake that perspective distance, so that you're looking at something that's further away, but the objects and the buildings are still the same size as the objects and buildings or structures that are closer to you. So a true isometric map is fictional in that the world doesn't actually work that way when you're looking through your eyes, but it works in a game, or it works in a representation, because the things that are closer to you are just as important as the things that are further away are just as important as the things that are close to you. So they're equivalent in size relations.
Does that make sense?
Okay.
So if you as a listener wants to try this, I just want to give you a heads up, it's very difficult to do. I have tried to draw like these isometric maps for the last week, and it's so difficult when you're used to draw perspective.
Yeah.
I'm very comfortable at drawing perspective map, or drawing perspective pictures, and this is like a restructuring of my brain. It's very difficult to
I think
to draw. Yeah.
If you want to see the most difficult perspective map or isometric map I've ever worked on, there's a map of Skullport, the city that is situated in caverns underneath Waterdeep in the Forgotten Realms. Google or just look for Skullport, and it's on my website, prints.mikeschley.com.
It has almost kind of Vienna feel to it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for that map specifically, I did get quite a bit of direction from Wizards of the Coast as to the footprints or the basic outlines of what buildings needed to be where, because it's very specific to the adventure that it was in, or I think that originally came out in either Dragon Magazine or Dungeon Magazine. Issue 200 of Dungeon Magazine. Anyways, so the issue was that I got 3 maps of building locations from my art director, but they were all top-down maps of 3 different levels of the city, and their request was that I basically create an isometric view of this city with these 3 maps stacked on top of one another and in a realistic space in the caverns under Waterdeep. And I I think my brain was bleeding a little bit after I finished this thing, because they all work, but it's all in isometric perspective, and it's complex, but it's functional. So yeah, isometrics are fun, but they're definitely a lot more work than a traditional top-down map. But the reason that I like them, and the reason that I like perspective maps, is that it's that mixture between the utility of cartography and the aesthetic or the visual joy of landscape painting or cityscape painting or illustration, in a sense.
I also feel like perspective maps doesn't come across as like isometric map does. You get much more, as you say, information out of an isometric map than a perspective map, because things get so small in the horizon.
Absolutely. And with a isometric map, they still serve as maps. And although I can't really. I have seen some absolutely gorgeous examples of perspective maps that work as great cartographic tools, but they typically tend to be like, I remember some from National Geographic where they would do isometric maps, perspective maps of mountainous areas in the Alps, and they would focus on the area that that you were interested in, and then it would gradually roll off to the horizon in the distance. But I mean, as far as pieces of artwork and utilizable cartography, they were absolutely gorgeous. And that's a skill set that is incredibly technically demanding, so that you've got a perspective map that still reads as a map, or you've got this broad perspective image as if seen from a plane or a hot air balloon. And yeah, they're gorgeous. But I think that there's something really useful and fun about isometrics that perspectives just don't. They're just different beasts.
Yeah.
And they can really be beasts.
They can. So, where do you find your inspiration for when you draw maps? Is it by looking at town on Google, or is it like?
I look at it. Yeah. I do a lot of surfing on Google Maps, but there's a number of books that I have on hand that are illustrations of architectural details and planning, historical maps or historical illustrations of like 16th and 15th century British cottages. It's just some beautiful pencil drawings, and I can't remember the name of the book. There's this old book that I found at a used bookstore that's probably about 100 years old, and it's full of just absolutely gorgeous plates. I think they're actually lithographs, but they're essentially drawings of cottages and historic buildings, that most of which I don't think exist anymore. But they give a really interesting peek into the architecture of utilitarian spaces as they were being used.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. So looking at things like that, looking at historical research from various. When I was living in Arizona, which is in the southwest of the U.S., a while ago, and had the opportunity to meet an archaeologist whose main influence or main area of interest was Mayan, or rather Aztec construction and architectural basically he spent a lot of time going down into Mexico, specifically around Mexico City, and investigating not only large pyramid structures, but specifically the sort of daily lives of the average Aztec people. So a lot of one of the things that I really got out of my experience with them was that huge tombs and areas of intense interest by the majority of archaeologists or the majority of historians, they're interesting, but they only compose of a small portion of the overall culture and experience of that people. So he was spending a lot of time, digging up refuse pits and houses of everyday common folks, trying to get a sense of the life experience of the a broader cross range of that society. So when I think about maps, or when I think about building worlds, I tend to think a lot about how the everyday people that live in this place would utilize that location for just normal workaday life. So I tend to look at a lot of historic recreations of cottage interiors and cooking hearths. A lot of times, by convention, if you're going to include a fireplace in a schematic of a house, a lot of times it's super easy to just build a fireplace that looks like a standard, what we think of as a fireplace in our modern 20th century homes, when the hearth in a historic or medieval house wasn't built like that for a number of reasons, where their homes and their hearths that you could walk into, because they were essentially large cutout. Imagine like a closet without a wall that's made out of stone that you could set, you could build a fire on the floor of, and the entire top portion of that little room was essentially a funnel to catch all that smoke, all the smoke from your cooking fire, and take it out of the house. So instead of the small little quaint suburban fireplace, the fireplace in a medieval or a 12th century home was much, if it wasn't just a little hovel, it was much larger and more a holistic part of the kitchen and the living area, so that you might have it situated in the center of a building between the kitchen and the living space, so that not only could you use it for cooking, but it would also heat the house in a dual purpose or dual function. So thinking about that in the process of formulating maps, I think, is just kind of part of my work process.
So all this information you have used to make slidescapes.
Yeah. So a lot of what I'm hoping to do with Schlyscapes is a synthesis. Well, not really a synthesis, but something new that was that is influenced or developed off of my experience, both as a cartographer, an illustrator, and hopefully a storyteller. And building, in the process, building a world that can be explored or can be a supplement to storytelling for a DM, or used in a variety of applications. And
so I actually think we should wrap up now, because we have hit the 50-minute mark.
Gotcha. Well, I had a great time. I hope I was clear enough and enjoyable enough to talk to you. It was a lot of fun. And
the best thing, there was no power drill.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. I don't know if you'd mentioned this, but the last time we tried to record, my 10 minutes before we started before we were going to record, the landlord decided to start renovating the apartment upstairs.
That was
And
that was kind of like an anticlimax.
yeah, I know. I'm so sorry about that, but
well, we got around to record today, so thank you very much.
yeah, oh, thank you so much. Have a great one.
Yeah, you too. So that was my talk with Mike Schley. That was really exciting. I hope you enjoyed it too. I have one more little piece of information that you might enjoy. I am doing a giveaway of one of Mike's maps, and it is not just a map. It is a signed map, signed by Mike Schley himself. It is the picture of Waterdeep that he will sign a poster. So into the giveaway that you can enter via gleam.io. I will hand the information down below, and I will also give information on various social media, so stay tuned for that. Thank you for listening in.